Imagine sitting on a bus, hearing a stranger tell a kid he doesn't belong here. Would you speak up, or would you sit there in silence like everyone else? The bus smelled of damp fabric and cheap cologne, the kind that lingered long after its wearer had stepped off. 17-year-old Malik Johnson barely noticed. His mind was still caught in the final moments of last period, replaying his teacher's words about an upcoming history project. He hated group work. It always ended the same way. He did the heavy lifting while his partners slacked off. As he adjusted his backpack and found his usual seat near the middle of the bus, he barely registered the woman a few rows ahead. Margaret Whitman, at least that's what the name on her leather purse said, sat stiffly, clutching the handles like the bus might suddenly tip over. She was the type of woman Malik had learned to ignore. Older, tense, carrying herself like the world owed her something. The bus creaked forward, merging into traffic. A group of kids from a different high school laughed loudly near the back, their voices bouncing off the scratched-up windows. A man in a construction vest sat up front, tapping his knee to a beat only he could hear. Malik pulled out his phone, hoping music would drown out everything. But before he could put in his earbuds, a sharp voice sliced through the chatter. "I don't know what this city is turning into." It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it was loud enough to make Malik glance up. Margaret was shaking her head, her lips pursed in disapproval. Her eyes flicked toward him for just a second before she looked away. Malik had seen that look before, on teachers who expected less from him, on store clerks who watched him too closely, on neighbors who pretended not to see him when he walked by. He turned back to his phone. Not today. He wasn't about to let some bitter old woman ruin his ride home. But the thing about people like her, they don't stop at one comment. The bus rolled on, but the air inside felt different now, like something was about to break. The bus lurched forward at a red light, sending a ripple through the passengers. Malik gripped the handle of his seat, steadying himself. He had almost convinced himself to ignore her, to let it roll off his back like he always did. But Margaret wasn't finished. "This used to be a nice place," she muttered, louder this time. A few people glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away. No one wanted to get involved. Malik stayed silent, hoping she would stop. She didn't. Kids these days have no respect. Coming in, taking over, acting like they own everything. Makes you wonder where they even came from. That was it. Malik's fingers curled around his phone, his pulse kicking up a notch. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Pick your battles, Malik. Some fights aren't worth it." Maybe this was one of them. Maybe he should let her talk and keep his head down. But then she turned fully toward him, her eyes narrowing like she had finally decided who to aim her words at. "You don't belong here. Go back to Africa." The bus went dead silent. Malik felt every pair of eyes shift in his direction. Some people looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, pretending to be absorbed in their phones. Others just watched, waiting to see what he'd do. The man in the construction vest up front stopped tapping his knee. Even the loud kids in the back had quieted. For a second, Malik did nothing. He sat still, staring at the woman who had just flung those words at him like they were facts, like she had the right to decide where he belonged. A part of him wanted to laugh at how ridiculous she sounded, how tired and small her words felt. But another part of him burned, not with anger, with something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that settles in when you've seen too much of this, lived too much of it, and still, people like her act like they're saying something new. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as everyone waited for what would happen next. Malik could feel the weight of every single stare pressing down on him. His hands clenched around his phone, but he forced himself to breathe, slow and steady. Margaret's expression didn't waver. She sat there, shoulders squared, waiting for him to lash out, to give her an excuse to roll her eyes and say, "See, that's exactly what I mean." He wasn't going to give her that, but he also wasn't going to let it slide. A man near the front cleared his throat. No words, just a noise, the kind people make when they want to say something but don't want to get involved. A teenage girl near the back glanced at her friend, eyes wide. A woman in a navy blazer shifted uncomfortably, gripping the strap of her purse. And yet, no one said anything. Malik finally spoke. "What did you just say?" His voice was calm. Steady. Almost too steady. Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. You heard me. Malik leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. Yeah, I did. I just want to make sure you hear yourself. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. I don't need to explain anything to you. You sure about that? He asked. Because right now, I think everyone here would love to know why you think you get to decide where I belong. A few heads turned back toward Margaret. Someone near the front let out a quiet chuckle. Quick, almost nervous. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Just for a second. Then just as quickly it was gone. People like you, she started, but Malik cut her off. People like me what? He let the words hang there, daring her to finish the sentence. Margaret hesitated, and in that tiny pause, Malik saw it. She wasn't expecting pushback. She wasn't expecting someone like him, a teenager, a kid in her eyes, to meet her words head on. But now, the entire bus was watching, waiting, and she wasn't as sure of herself anymore. Malik took a breath, steadying himself. You know what's funny? He said, his voice calm but firm. You're sitting here telling me to go back to Africa like this country doesn't belong to people like me. But tell me something. Where do you think you came from? Margaret's lips pursed, but she didn't speak. You think your ancestors just sprouted out of the ground right here in America? Malik continued. Because they didn't. Just like mine didn't. A few murmurs rippled through the bus. Someone near the front nodded slightly, just enough for Malik to notice. The difference between you and me, he said, leaning forward slightly. My ancestors were brought here in chains. They weren't given a choice, but they built this country. Every brick, every road, every law that you take for granted, black hands helped make that happen. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. Oh, give me a break. No, Malik interrupted, his voice sharper now. You don't get to brush it off. You don't get to act like history didn't happen just because it makes you uncomfortable. The bus was silent now, except for the faint hum of the engine beneath them. Silence keeps things the same. But speaking, that's how things begin to shift.